So we spent a lot of time so far giving an overview of concurrency, giving an overview of parallelism. We talked about some mechanisms for doing concurrency and some mechanisms for doing parallelism to program them in Java. But I really haven't spent much time explaining why you would use parallelism or the context in which you should use parallelism. And as it turns out, parallelism is not necessarily something you're going to want to use all the time. And so it's important to understand the circumstances under which you should apply it. First thing to note, parallelism is not a panacea. And I love this particular image because it really shows the reality often. So this is parallelism in theory. Each of the different little tasks or little puppies is well behaved and staying within its lane and eating its food, and there's no fighting or anything. And that's what things look like in practice sometimes. You have contention, you have different threads or different concurrent units of execution competing for things, and it can become a big mess if you're not very careful. So you need to figure out when to use parallel processing. And here's the circumstances under which it's best applied. Parallelism works best when tasks are independent. What that means is that each of the different subtasks that are forked to make the small units of computation can all run sequentially and easily, but together they all run in parallel. And a great example of this that you probably know if you've lived in a dorm very long is the concept of a laundromat, where you go in and you've got a bunch of washers or dryers, and you can wash your clothes in parallel in the different washers. You can dry your clothes in parallel in the different dryers. And that's because there's no dependency between a load in one washer and a load in another. So they can all run in parallel. And in fact, there's a name for this. It's called embarrassingly parallel. And embarrassingly parallel is just a funny phrase that means there's little or no, typically no, dependencies or need for communication between separate tasks to share anything as they're doing their computations. They can all run in isolation, just like the laundromat example. Now, sometimes people say, what the heck, embarrassingly parallel? What's embarrassing about that? Well, the best analogy I can think of is the phrase embarrassment of riches, which is a phrase that means you have so much, it's too much of a good thing. Elon Musk may very well have an embarrassment of riches. Depending on whether you like his tweets or not, you may think he's embarrassing, but he certainly has an overabundance of certain things. So at any rate, that's where the term embarrassing comes from. It's very strange. In fact, the funny part here is this particular meme has an embarrassing typo because embarrassment is spelled wrong. So that's the embarrassment. That's probably why the thinker is being embarrassed. Another context in which parallelism works best is when you have lots of data and processing to perform. And some of you know what this is. This is the Terra Cotta warrior army, which is an analogy I use often for many pieces of data to process. It's really fascinating. It's in China. And so if you have a lot of data and a lot of processing to perform, then parallelism can be very effective then too. In fact, there's a formula described in this particular talk by Brian Getz, who's one of the chief architects of Java and a parallel programming expert, concurrent programming expert, and he calls it the n times q model. And the way to think of this is when n is large, n being the number of elements, when n is large and q is large or high, q is the quantity of CPU processing per element of data. So when you have a lot of data and a lot of processing for the data, and when the processing is independent, then you get a big win from parallel processing. Conversely, if you have a small amount of data and or a small amount of processing, parallelism actually can make things worse. It'll be slower, and we'll talk about that when we get into this in more detail later. So n times q, and people say, well, what's the magic number? I think he uses 10,000 or 25,000. It's just a number he picked out of thin air probably, but if you do some experiments, you'll see there's a break-even point on any given piece of hardware and software infrastructure where parallelism is a win, and below that point, it's not really a win, and above that point, it's a win. So that's a nice model. Another way to look at this is you got to benchmark your programs to see if it's actually going to help. Another condition under which parallelism works is when tasks neither block nor share mutable state. Now that's a little similar to the independent thing we talked about before, but it's a slight twist in a small way. So sharing mutable state, if you remember, mutable state is the root of all evil in concurrent programming. So in parallel programming, we often try to avoid mutable state. So if you don't share mutable state and you don't have to block, especially on I/O, then you can get a big win. And that's why Java has this fork join pool abstraction we talked about that supports work stealing. And if you recall, work stealing is when one thread that doesn't have anything to do will go and steal work from another thread that's got too much to do. The idea there is to avoid blocking. We steal work instead of blocking or idling or spinning. And the whole fork join paradigm, which takes one task or one chunk of data and splits it up into smaller tasks and smaller chunks of data. And the idea there is to avoid sharing mutable state. So that's why things are done in that particular way. And of course, it should be pretty obvious that when you have lots of cores and lots of processors or processors, you're going to get a bigger win from parallelism. If you got one core, there are situations under which you can get a speed up depending on how I/O bound your tasks are, but you're going to get a much better speed up if you have lots of cores. So my wonderful 10-core MacBook Pro, that's very scalable, and I'll show you some examples later to demonstrate that. Okay, so that's the end of when you might apply parallel programming in practice. We'll come back and talk about this in more detail when we get into the nitty-gritty nuances of Java parallel streams, and we'll look at this with more examples as well.